My name is Alice, and I work at an elite countryside resort club in Switzerland. My job is more than just event planning. It's about creating a world for those who can afford to forget their worries and enjoy life. Every day, I am surrounded by luxury, glamour, and the attention of the rich and famous. Yet, this luxury brings me no joy. My husband, Victor, runs a chain of restaurants and is often away on business trips. Our relationship has long since turned into a routine. At first, I tried not to notice the growing coldness between us, but now the feeling is so obvious that it seems as if the air around us has frozen. I feel lonely, despite the fact that our life looks like a dream from the outside. The monotony of our marriage drives me to seek solace in my work. I start to come up with all kinds of scenarios for events, hoping to find something that will ignite me. But one day, everything changed. A new general manager arrived at the club, Thomas Dahl, a man with an extraordinary charm who immediately began changing the rules of the game. He was mysterious, confident, and seemed to be able to anticipate my every move. From the first days of his presence at the club, it became clear that Thomas had no intention of sticking to tradition. His unconventional approach to management sparked a storm of emotions among the staff, but something in his manner drew my attention. Thomas knew how to play people like a musician plays an instrument, subtly, skillfully, with barely perceptible notes of manipulation. He became someone impossible not to think about. It was then that I realized I needed more than just the daily routine. Thomas was like fresh air in the stuffy room of my life, and I couldn't help but feel his presence. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't help myself. When I arrived at work that day, I was confident that everything was under control. I had spent an entire week organizing a grand event for VIP guests, preparing every detail meticulously. Every flower, every decoration, and even the music had been chosen with careful consideration. I was proud of my work and knew the evening promised to be perfect. But as soon as I entered the main hall, I felt something was wrong. The waitstaff whispered nervously. The technical crew rushed back and forth, and my assistants looked lost. Tension hung in the air, and I realized something had happened. "What's going on?" I asked, turning to the head maitre d'. "Ma'am, we have a problem." He looked visibly distressed. "Mr. Dahl has canceled your event." "What?" My voice wavered, and I felt my heart race. "How? Why?" "He said it doesn't align with the club's new strategy." The maitre d' looked like he could hardly believe his own words. I was furious. How dare he? Without warning, without explanation, without the slightest respect for my work. I marched to Thomas's office, feeling the anger grow inside me. Thomas sat at his desk, looking completely unbothered as I burst into his office. "You canceled my event?" My words came out sharper than I intended. He looked up and smiled slightly, as if he had anticipated my reaction. "Yes," he replied calmly. "It doesn't fit with the new vision of the club." "New vision?" I was ready to explode with anger. "You didn't even discuss this with me. This was my idea, my project." Thomas stood up and stepped closer, his face still calm, but there was a spark in his eyes. "Alice," he began in a soft tone, "I understand you're upset. But the club needs changes, and your event, it was too conservative for our new strategy." Conservative? I couldn't believe my ears. It was an elegant event for the most influential people. "Exactly." He crossed his arms over his chest, studying me. "But sometimes, you have to take risks to surprise. And I suggest we discuss this over dinner. We could talk about the club's strategy and your ideas. What do you say?" I paused, trying to discern his motives. Maybe he just wanted to push me towards something new, or maybe it was another manipulation. But something in his tone, in his confidence, sparked a strange curiosity in me. I wanted to understand what drove this man and, at the same time, figure out my own feelings, which were so unexpected and dangerous. "All right," I finally replied. "Let's discuss it over dinner." The dinner started in one of the club's private rooms, decorated in a classic style. Candles stood on the table, their soft light creating a warm, almost intimate atmosphere. Thomas arrived a little later than the appointed time, but his demeanor was so confident that it didn't even occur to me to reproach him for being late. From the first minutes of our conversation, I felt that he was playing a game. His words were carefully chosen, every sentence wrapped in mystery. He spoke about changes in the club, about his vision for its development, but behind every word of his, there was something more. "You know, Alice," he began, twirling a glass of wine in his hand, "change always scares people, but without it, there is no growth. Haven't you ever wanted to do something that completely changes your life?" His question caught me off guard. I felt as if he was getting under my skin, making me think about things I hadn't even admitted to myself. I tried to maintain a neutral expression, but something stirred inside my chest. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep a calm tone. "But some changes can destroy what has been built over years." Thomas smiled, his gaze sharp like a blade. "Sometimes that's exactly what is needed to build something new, isn't it?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Haven't you ever wanted to step outside the boundaries of the ordinary?" I felt his words pierce through me. He was watching my reactions, every move, every gesture. I realized he was masterfully manipulating me. But something inside resisted, while another part was drawn to him. At some point, his hand lightly touched mine, and I felt the warmth of his skin. The contact was almost imperceptible, but a wave of heat surged through my body. I pulled my hand back, but felt something begin to tremble inside me. "I think you're quite used to such manipulations," I said, trying to regain control. Thomas laughed. His laugh was soft, but full of confidence. "Manipulations? Perhaps. But I prefer to think I just know how to find the key to each person," he smiled. And there was something enticing and dangerous in his smile. "For you, for example, I could also find a key. If, of course, you allow it." My mind screamed that this was wrong, but my body betrayed me, drawing me closer to him. Thomas suggested continuing the evening in a more informal setting, hinting at a secluded spot on the club's grounds where no one would see us. His gaze was filled with confidence and curiosity. "Why not?" I replied, trying to remain calm. "It could be interesting." But deep down, I knew the game had only just begun. We stepped outside, leaving behind the cozy hall of the club. Thomas led me to one of the more secluded corners of the grounds, a place rarely visited in the evening. It was quiet and private, with the light from the club barely breaking through the thick canopy of trees. I felt strange. A mix of excitement and anxiety filled me. "It's quite peaceful here," I noted, trying to steer the conversation into safer territory. Thomas smiled his signature enigmatic smile and nodded. "Silence is a great backdrop for honest conversations, don't you think?" His voice was soft, yet confident. I looked at him, trying to decipher the direction he was taking our conversation. Thomas began talking about his passions, about how he had always been fascinated by psychology, human nature, and its darker sides. "Have you ever experienced a true emotional shock, Alice?" he suddenly asked, his gaze becoming more intense. I felt everything freeze inside me. His question was too personal, too probing. It seemed as if he was trying to go deeper than was appropriate. "Everyone has their own upheavals," I replied cautiously, not wanting to reveal my true feelings. Thomas stepped closer, so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. but I'm not talking about everyday experiences. I'm talking about something that turns your life upside down." He laughed quietly, as if his own words amused him. "Something that forces you to see your true self." I felt his hand lightly touch my shoulder, his touch unexpected and searing. I shivered but did not pull away. His fingers slowly glided along my arm, leaving a barely perceptible sensation of warmth on my skin. "Maybe you're right," I whispered, not believing my own words. "But I'm not sure I want to discuss it now." Thomas continued to stand close, his touches becoming more insistent. He leaned towards me, and I felt his lips almost brush against mine. It was at that moment that I suddenly realized where this game was leading. My mind seemed to awaken from a fog, and I knew I was crossing a line I didn't want to cross. "No!" I stepped back sharply, raising my hand in a gesture of refusal. "I can't. I don't want this." A flicker of displeasure crossed his face, but he quickly regained his composure, putting on a polite smile. "Of course," he said calmly, though his eyes shone with disappointment. "I understand. Sometimes we're not ready to step over ourselves." I felt a sense of relief, but also some disappointment. I knew I had made the right choice, but something inside me continued to be drawn to him, despite all reason and logic. After that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. It seemed like I had made the right decision, stepping back before the situation got out of hand, but something inside me wouldn't let me rest. I began to notice how my eyes searched for him in the crowd, how I listened for every sound, expecting to hear his voice. Thomas didn't disappear from my life. On the contrary, he seemed even more present, as if his presence was everywhere. When we crossed paths at work, he would smile, but his smile was cold, lacking the charm it once had. He continued to flirt, but each time his words sounded more distant, with a hint of indifference. This change in his behavior worried me, but it also attracted me. I felt I was becoming dependent on his attention, like a fish on a hook, and the more he pulled away, the more I was drawn to him. "Are you okay, Alice?" my colleague Olga asked one day when I was once again staring into space. "Yes, just a little tired," I replied, trying to hide my real thoughts. But that wasn't the truth. I couldn't concentrate on work. My thoughts kept drifting back to Thomas. I was trying to understand why his behavior affected me so deeply. Was it because he was the first person in a long time to stir such emotions in me? Maybe I was looking for something more than just solace in the routine. Our meetings became less friendly. He would come to meetings, barely glancing at me, but his words grew sharper. Thomas made barely noticeable hints at my weaknesses, my fears, highlighting my insecurities. He seemed to know how to press on the most painful points, to bring out everything I wanted to hide, even from myself. "You know, sometimes I think you're afraid to live truly," he said one day when we crossed paths in the corridor. "Maybe you're used to letting others make decisions for you." His words pierced me like a knife. I felt a tightness in my chest, a mix of pain and resentment. He was playing on my feelings, and even though I knew it, I couldn't stop myself from being drawn to him. I saw contempt in his eyes, but also a challenge, and something in that challenge captivated me. Victor seemed more distant than ever. Our rare conversations were superficial, lacking any real intimacy. I realized I couldn't return to the life I once knew. Something had changed in me, something irreversible. Thomas had become a sort of test for me, one I couldn't refuse. I realized that this dependence was growing stronger every day, and the more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull towards him became. I was trapped in my own feelings and the fear of losing something that had never truly been mine. But despite all of this, I still had a desire to regain that closeness with Victor, to return to the simplicity that had been missing for so long. Yet my thoughts were now occupied with something else. That evening, I came home late, my mind filled with anxiety and doubt. I knew that my feelings for Thomas had become too complex, too tangled. But the next day, when I saw him, my heart started to race again, as if everything that had happened only added fuel to the fire. He approached me in the club's hallway, and I felt a tightness inside. Thomas was calm and confident, but there was a determination burning in his eyes. He smiled, but there was something predatory in that smile. "We need to talk," he said, his voice soft but firm. I wanted to object, but he took my hand and led me into one of the empty offices on the second floor. The door closed behind us, and a tense silence settled in the room. "Thomas, what are you doing?" I whispered, trying to pull away, but he stepped closer, his hand still holding mine. "I think you know what I'm doing." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I want you to stop fighting what's between us." His face was just inches from mine, and before I could reply, he suddenly leaned in and kissed me. I felt his lips on mine, first soft, then more insistent. My thoughts froze for a moment, and I allowed myself to respond to his kiss, feeling something long buried awaken inside me. But suddenly, I realized what was happening and pulled back, trying to regain control over myself. "No, Thomas," I said, pushing him away. "I don't want this. It's not right." He sighed, his face growing sterner. "Why are you resisting, Alice? You know you want this just as much as I do." His voice grew colder, almost angry. "I can't," I began, but he cut me off. "Can't or won't." Thomas narrowed his eyes, his gaze becoming harsher. "If you think you can just walk away, you're mistaken." I felt a tension build inside me. His tone had changed. There was a threat in it. "If you don't change your decision and continue what we started, I will tell everyone about our little games. You know how quickly rumors spread in a place like our club. I can make sure your reputation is ruined in a day." "You wouldn't dare," I started, but deep down, I already knew he was capable of anything. "Oh, believe me, I can." His smile became even more predatory. "And that's not all. I have influence with the club's management. I can make sure you lose your job." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I realized that Thomas would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He saw my weakness and was determined to exploit it fully. I was trapped. Every step I took, every word I spoke could be used against me. Now I knew that every decision I made would have consequences, and whatever I chose, I had already lost this game. The next workday began in a haze. I woke up early, feeling a heaviness in my chest that wouldn't let me breathe freely. My thoughts kept returning to Thomas's words, his threats, and that moment when I felt trapped. I knew I couldn't afford to lose my job. It was my only stability, my anchor in this chaotic world. Victor was absorbed in his own affairs, and I was left alone with the awful realization that my life was now under the control of a man I feared, yet was strangely drawn to. When I arrived at the club, my hands were trembling, and my legs could barely move. I knew I had to talk to Thomas and agree to his terms. The fear of losing everything outweighed my pride and common sense. I felt like I was on the brink, not only of losing my job, but of destroying everything I had ever built. "Thomas," I said quietly when we were alone again in the hallway. He turned and saw all the pain and fear in my eyes that I could no longer hide. "I'll agree to your terms." My voice was barely a whisper. "Just stop this pressure." He smiled like a winner in a long-planned game. "I'm glad you made the right choice," he said, his gaze softened. But I felt it was just a mask. But inside me, Everything was boiling. All day, I felt like a prisoner of my own fears. Every word of his, every touch now felt like a chain tightening around my neck. I realized that my feelings for Thomas had become a huge problem for me. I was no longer free. I lived in constant fear of his manipulations, of what he might do. I began to avoid him, trying not to cross his path, but it turned out to be almost impossible. He continued to pursue me with his threats and subtle hints, making my life unbearable. His presence was everywhere, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Days passed, and I felt more and more that my life was spiraling out of control. I could no longer endure this tension, this endless fear. At some point, I realized that this could not continue. I needed to find out the truth about Thomas, about his past, to understand how to protect myself from him. I began asking colleagues about him, trying not to attract attention. One of the staff, whom I had worked with for some time, finally gave me a few hints. Thomas had been involved in scandalous situations before, using his power for manipulation and control. I realized that I had no choice but to get to the bottom of it. For the first time in a long time, I felt strength and determination, not to submit, but to fight. My suspicions about Thomas were not unfounded. One of my colleagues, whom I had worked with for a long time and always trusted, finally decided to tell me the truth. We were sitting in a cafe near the club, and I listened intently to every word, feeling anxiety growing in my chest. "Thomas isn't who he seems to be," he began, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "He has been at the center of scandals more than once. He always uses his power to manipulate people, especially women." I felt a chill run through my body. My colleague's words confirmed my worst fears. Thomas was dangerous, and now he had set his sights on me. "He threatened me," I confessed, openly sharing my worries for the first time. "He said he would ruin my reputation and career if I didn't comply with his desires." My colleague nodded, his face serious. "He knows how to press on weak spots. Others have faced this too, but many chose to leave rather than confront him." I felt anger rising inside me. I could no longer remain in fear. I had to do something to break this vicious circle. I made a decision. I needed to meet with him and put an end to this. I went to his office the next day, ready to confront him. Thomas greeted me with his usual smile, but there was a dangerous spark in his eyes. "We need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. "Of course." He made a welcoming gesture. "I'm listening." I stepped closer, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, but this time not from fear, but from determination. "I know about your past," I said, looking him straight in the eyes. "I know you've manipulated people and ruined lives, and I won't let you do this to me." For a moment, his face remained expressionless, but then anger flared in his eyes. Thomas stood up, his smile vanishing. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice low and threatening. "If you think you can bring me down, you're sorely mistaken. I'll make sure you regret this decision." "Try," I replied, trying to stay composed. "But I'm not playing your games anymore." His face twisted with rage, and I knew he wouldn't stop. Thomas began his campaign to discredit me. Soon, rumors spread throughout the club. I was accused of mistakes I hadn't made. Gossip and lies spread like a virus. Colleagues began to treat me with suspicion, and management called me in for constant meetings. And then I realized that, in the end, it was my fault. I had allowed myself to be drawn into this game, had let Thomas manipulate me from the very beginning. My desire to escape the routine, the emptiness of my marriage, had led me to this moment. I had chosen this path of betrayal and deceit, and now I was paying the price. Perhaps I needed to go through this experience to understand what I am truly worth and what I really want. The rumors spread with incredible speed, like fire caught in the wind. Thomas knew how to manipulate people and used his influence to the fullest. Soon, the club began whispering that I had used my position for personal gain and intrigue. They said I had deliberately tried to undermine the reputations of other employees and advance myself through connections. I saw how people began to distrust me. Colleagues who had once been friendly and supportive now looked at me with suspicion. Every day became more difficult, and I felt the ground slipping from under my feet. My attempts to defend myself seemed useless, as if the whole world had believed Thomas's lies. The most painful blow came when Victor found out about my involvement with Thomas. Not knowing all the details, he concluded that I had betrayed him. We had barely spoken lately, but his eyes spoke louder than words. There was so much pain and disappointment in them. "I'm filing for divorce," he said coldly, as we sat down for what turned out to be our last dinner together. "Victor, wait. You don't know the whole truth," I tried to explain, feeling my throat tighten with tears. "The truth?" he scoffed, but there was no amusement in his eyes. "The truth is that trust between us is lost, and without trust, there is no point in continuing." I couldn't blame him. My actions, even if driven by desperation and Thomas's manipulations, had destroyed what we had. I lost him, and with him, everything I had known as stability vanished. Soon after that, I lost my job. The club's management, succumbing to pressure and rumors, decided that my presence was no longer desirable. I received a termination notice filled with dry language, citing inappropriate behavior and non-compliance with corporate standards. I lost everything: my job, my husband, the respect of my colleagues. Thomas had won this game. I felt broken and hollow, as if I had been stripped of everything that mattered. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't let this destroy me completely. Yes, I had lost, but my life was not over. I had to find a way to get back on my feet, despite all the blows. I couldn't let Thomas take away my will to live. Now I understood that all these trials were lessons I had to go through. And even though I no longer had the life I once knew, I still had myself. And that, no one could take away from me. I left the city that once was my home. With every mile I moved away from familiar places, I felt the past saying goodbye, leaving behind only memories. I chose a small town where no one knew me, where I could start fresh, without the shadow of Thomas and without the pain associated with everything I had lost. I found a job at a small company that organized events. It was a simple position, but I accepted it with gratitude. I needed something to help me regain my confidence, to feel useful again. The team was small and friendly, and no one knew about my past, my mistakes and failures. At first, everything was difficult. I constantly caught myself fearing another failure, but day by day, I learned to let go of my fears. I realized that to move forward, I had to come to terms with what had happened and accept it as part of my experience, not as a stigma. My new life began with small steps. I learned to find joy in simple things: a morning coffee, a colleague's smile, a casual conversation. I decided that my mistakes did not define me. They were just a part of who I had become. Gradually, I began to understand that my experiences and my story could be useful to others. Looking back, I saw how I had allowed Thomas to manipulate me, to use my weaknesses, and I realized that I wanted to use this experience to help other people who found themselves in similar situations. I signed up for courses in psychological support and assistance to victims of emotional abuse and manipulation. I felt that I could find a new calling in this. My story My mistakes could become an important lesson for someone, helping them not to repeat my errors. With each passing day, I realized more and more that life does not end with mistakes and falls. On the contrary, it is in these moments that we find our true strength. Now I knew I could go through anything, no matter what happened. I decided never again to allow others to control my life, and perhaps I could help others do the same. I began attending support groups, and it became an important part of my healing journey. At first, I didn't know what to expect. It was scary to talk about what I had been through, to admit my mistakes in front of strangers. But I found that there was no place for judgment in these groups. Every person who came here brought their own pain, their own wounds, and in a way, we were all equals. I shared my story, spoke about how I had allowed Thomas to manipulate me, how I succumbed to his influence because I was too vulnerable and insecure. I talked about how my decisions had led to the collapse of my career and marriage, and to the loss of respect for myself. But with each meeting, I felt the heaviness in my soul lighten. People listened, shared their own stories, and there was neither scorn nor condemnation in their eyes, only understanding and empathy. I began to realize that my path to healing would be long and difficult, but I was ready to walk it to the end. Each session revealed new truths to me. I realized that it was important not only to acknowledge my mistakes, but also to understand their causes, to forgive myself for them, and to move forward. I no longer wanted to be a victim. I decided that my life should belong only to me, and I would not allow anyone to control it anymore. I understood that one should never succumb to any form of manipulation, as it leads to terrible consequences. It's essential to set boundaries, to listen to oneself, and to protect one's interests, even if it seems difficult or frightening. With each day, I felt myself growing stronger, my will for life and freedom becoming more resilient. I continued to help others, sharing my experience and supporting those who had also suffered from manipulation and emotional abuse. This became not just a task, but a true calling for me. I saw how people found the strength to change, to see the world anew, and this inspired me to make my own changes. The story of my pain became the story of my rebirth. I realized that despite all the mistakes and losses, I had gained something more valuable, an awareness of my strength and readiness for a new life, a life free from fear and dependency. I was ready to move forward, knowing that new horizons and opportunities lay ahead. Now I knew I could get through anything.